I learned early. The most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make is thinking he understands a woman at first glance. The night smelled like expensive wine and quiet judgment, the kind that lingered in the air of places I didn't belong, places where a single mistake could cost more than my monthly rent, and I was already on my second double shift that week, my feet aching inside worn-out black flats as I balanced a tray of crystal glasses worth more than my car. Weaving through a sea of tailored suits and silk dresses under golden chandeliers that cast everything in a soft, forgiving glow, everything except me. Because nothing about me blended into this world no matter how still I tried to move, no matter how carefully I kept my head down. And then he walked in, and the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just shifted, like gravity itself had adjusted to accommodate him. Conversations softened, shoulders straightened, and eyes followed without meaning to, because men like him didn't need to announce their presence. They carried it in the way they breathed, the way they owned the space between each step. Dominic Hayes. I heard someone whisper near the bar, like the name itself required a lower volume, like saying it too loudly might invite consequences, and I didn't look up right away. I'd learned not to. People like him didn't notice people like me unless something went wrong, and I had no intention of being noticed. Not tonight, not ever. But intention doesn't matter much when timing decides otherwise, because all it took was one distracted second, one slight shift of weight as someone brushed past me, one glass tilting just enough to break the balance I'd been holding all night, and suddenly the world narrowed to the slow, inevitable arc of dark red wine spilling forward, straight onto the front of a perfectly pressed white shirt that probably cost more than I made in a week. Silence didn't fall. It snapped, sharp and immediate, like the room itself was holding its breath, and I froze, tray still in my hands, heart pounding loud enough I was sure everyone could hear it. And then I looked up and met his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, the kind of eyes that didn't rush, didn't react, just assessed, calculated, decided, and for a second, just a second, I saw the exact moment he placed me in a category, small, insignificant, disposable, the kind of mistake that gets corrected and forgotten. Except I didn't look away. I didn't drop my gaze like I was supposed to. I didn't apologize the way every instinct in that room expected me to. I just stood there, breathing steady, meeting his stare like it was something I'd practiced, and that was the real mistake, not the wine, not the ruined shirt, but the fact that I didn't shrink, because something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to turn this from an accident into something else entirely, something deliberate, something personal. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but edged with something colder beneath the surface. Do you always make a scene? Or am I just special? And a few people laughed, quiet, nervous, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to. And I felt every eye in the room settle on me, waiting, expecting, predicting how this would go, the apology, the embarrassment, the quick exit, the reset of order. Except I didn't give them that either. I set the tray down slowly, carefully, like nothing about this moment was rushed, and I said, just as calm, just as steady. Accidents don't usually require an audience. And that's when I knew, before he even moved, before he even smiled, that the night had already gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Because powerful men don't like being answered. Not like that. Not by someone like me. And Dominic Hayes, he didn't look away this time. No one stepped in to save me, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man Dominic Hayes was, and the kind of power he carried into a room without ever raising his voice. Because power like that does not need noise. It just waits, and people move around it like it is already decided. And I could feel it now. The weight of expectation pressing in from every direction, the manager frozen near the bar pretending not to see, the other servers suddenly very busy with anything that did not involve this table, because no one interrupts a moment like this unless they are willing to own the consequences. And I had the strange, quiet realization that I was completely alone in this, just me and him. And the version of the story everyone thought they were about to witness. The waitress who made a mistake and the man who would remind her of her place. Except I had never been very good at playing the role people handed me. And that seemed to interest him more than the stains spreading slowly across his shirt. His gaze stayed on me, sharp, searching, like he was trying to figure out what was not lining up. Because people like me were supposed to apologize by now. We were supposed to look down, shrink, disappear, and I was doing none of that. And that was enough to shift the air again, subtle but real, like a crack forming in something that had always felt solid. He reached for a napkin, slow, deliberate, dabbing at the wine without breaking eye contact, not rushed, not annoyed, just controlled. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed, less amused now, more focused. "You do realize what that shirt costs," he said, not asking, just stating, like the number itself was part of the lesson I was supposed to learn, and maybe it was. Maybe in another version of this night I would have nodded quickly and said I would pay for it somehow, even if it meant working every shift for the next 6 months. But that version of me did not show up tonight. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, studying him the same way he was studying me, and I said, "Then I guess it is a good thing it is just a shirt." And I heard it. The small shift in the room, the intake of breath, the disbelief that someone in my position would say something like that out loud, directly to him. And for the first time, truly, I saw it land. Not anger, not yet, something closer to surprise, like I had stepped outside the script he was used to, and he did not immediately know how to pull me back into it. His jaw tightened just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And I was, because I had spent years reading small changes like that, the kind that happen before people decide what they are going to do next. And then he smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was the kind that comes with a decision already made. "Interesting," he said quietly, more to himself than to me, and then louder, for everyone to hear. "Let me ask you something." He stepped a little closer, not enough to touch, just enough to shift the distance between us into something intentional, something that felt less like an accident and more like a challenge. "Do you always talk like you have nothing to lose?" he asked. And there it was, the real question, not about the shirt, not about the mistake, but about me, about why I was not reacting the way I was supposed to. And I could have softened then. I could have stepped back into safety, but something in me refused, something steady and unshaken, and I answered him the only way that felt true. "No," I said, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "Just when I am talking to someone who thinks he already knows the ending." And for a second, a very small second, the room disappeared, the noise faded, and it was just us, standing in the middle of a moment neither of us had planned, and I could see it clearly now, the shift that had started the second I did not look away, because Dominic Hayes was no longer dealing with a mistake, he was dealing with a question, and powerful men do not like questions they cannot immediately answer. And that is when I realized this was not going to end with an apology. This was going somewhere else entirely, somewhere neither of us could pretend we did not see coming. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and sharp, like something about to snap, and I could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats without moving, in the way glasses stopped halfway to lips, in the way no one dared to interrupt what had become something far more than a simple mistake, because now it had direction. And Dominic Hayes was the kind of man who decided direction for everyone in the room. Except this time, he was not the only one doing the deciding, and I saw it happen. The exact second he stopped treating this like a minor inconvenience and started treating it like a problem that needed to be solved, his eyes narrowed just enough to sharpen his focus, not on the situation, but on me, like I had just become something he needed to understand. And that was dangerous in a different way. Because curiosity from someone like him was never harmless. It was strategic, deliberate, and I had just given him a reason to keep looking. He took another step closer, closing the distance in a way that made the rest of the room feel even further away, like we were standing inside our own separate space now, one defined by tension instead of music. "You think you know me already," he said, voice lower now, controlled but carrying easily across the silence, and I shook my head slightly, not breaking eye contact. "No," I said. "I think you are used to people pretending they do not see you clearly." And that landed differently. Not like a challenge, but like a mirror. And people do not like mirrors unless they recognize the reflection. His expression stilled, completely, the kind of stillness that means something is being recalculated, adjusted, rewritten. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I had gone too far, if this was the point where the line would finally appear. The one I was not supposed to cross. But it did not come, not the way everyone expected. Instead, he exhaled slowly, almost thoughtfully. And then something unexpected happened. He laughed, not loudly, not mockingly, just a quiet, genuine sound that did not match the tension in the room. And that confused everyone, including me, because that was not the reaction they were waiting for. And it shifted everything again. "All right," he said, straightening slightly, adjusting his cuff like the ruined shirt no longer mattered, like the moment had evolved past it. "Let us make this simple." And there it was, the pivot, the moment where he took control back in a way that felt cleaner, sharper, more intentional. "You embarrassed me," he continued, calm, measured. "And you did it in front of people who pay attention to things like that." His gaze flicked briefly to the surrounding tables, then back to me, locking in again. "So now I am curious," he said, and that word carried weight. Curiosity from him was not passive. It was a decision. "What exactly are you going to do about it?" And the room leaned in without moving, because now there was structure again, a question with an expected answer, an opening for me to correct everything, to step back into place, to restore balance the way it was supposed to be restored. But I felt it, the same steady calm that had been there from the start, unchanged, unmoved, and I realized something that made everything clearer than it should have been. He was not asking about the shirt. He was asking about control, about whether I would give it back to him or keep holding on to whatever it was I had taken without permission. And I could see in his eyes that he was already prepared for both outcomes. One bored him, the other interested him, and I knew exactly which one I was about to choose. I tilted my head slightly, just enough to signal I was considering him, not fearing him, and I said, "What do you want me to do?" And that was the moment, the real one, because I did not say it like someone asking for instructions. I said it like someone offering a decision back to him. And he heard it. I knew he did, because something in his posture shifted again, subtle, controlled, but different, like the game had just changed rules without anyone announcing it. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like recognition. "Good," he said quietly, almost approving. "Then let us not waste time pretending this is about laundry." And he paused just long enough for the room to lean even closer into the silence. "Fight me," he said, simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. And for the first time that night, I felt it. Not fear, not hesitation, something else entirely, something that settled deep and steady, like muscle memory waking up. And before anyone else could react, before the room could decide how to process what he had just said, I answered, just as calm, just as certain, "Okay." For a second, no one moved, like the entire room had forgotten how to process what had just happened, because men like Dominic Hayes did not get answered like that, not with calm, not with certainty, not by someone wearing a server uniform and standing in shoes that had seen too many 12-hour shifts. And yet there I was, already past the point where backing down made sense, already inside something that had shifted beyond a simple interaction into something sharper, more deliberate, and I could feel it in the way the air tightened, in the way even the music seemed quieter without actually stopping, like the room itself was waiting to see what he would do next, and I watched him closely, because this was the moment that mattered, not the challenge, not my answer, but his reaction to it. And for the first time that night, truly, I saw something I had not seen before, not control, not dominance, but interest, real interest. The kind that does not come often to someone who has already seen too much, already controlled too much, already won too many situations before they even began. His head tilted slightly, studying me like I had just become a problem worth solving instead of a mistake worth correcting. And then he nodded once, slow, decisive, like he had just confirmed something to himself that no one else in the room could hear. "Good," he repeated, quieter now, almost like the word belonged only to us. And then everything started moving again. Not chaotically, not loudly, but with purpose. Two men in dark suits who had been standing near the entrance stepped forward without being called, their presence subtle but unmistakable, not touching anyone, not saying anything, just creating space where space needed to exist, guiding the energy of the room away from the center and toward the edges. Like this was not the first time something unexpected had happened around him, and the system already knew how to respond. And I felt it then. The shift from public to private, from spectacle to something controlled, contained, intentional. Dominic glanced briefly toward the hallway that led away from the main dining area. Not a command, just a look. And it was enough. One of the staff members disappeared in that direction immediately, while the others pretended even harder not to see, not to hear, not to be involved, because whatever was about to happen did not belong to them. It belonged to him, and somehow, now, to me, "We are not doing this here," he said, his voice calm, almost casual, like he was deciding where to have a conversation instead of what kind of confrontation he had just created, and I nodded once, because I understood that too. This was not about chaos. This was about control, about setting the terms in a space where he did not have to share authority with anyone else. And as he turned slightly, motioning toward the hallway, I felt something settle inside me. Not nerves, not fear, something steadier, something older, like a part of me that had been quiet all night was finally waking up. And that was when I realized something that made everything clearer than it should have been. I was not following him because he told me to. I was walking because I had already decided to. And there is a difference people like him usually notice. And I wondered if he already had. We moved without rushing, step by step across polished floors that reflected the soft gold light above, past tables where conversations had resumed just enough to pretend normalcy, but not enough to hide the fact that everyone was still watching from the corners of their eyes, still trying to understand what kind of story they had just witnessed the beginning of. And as we reached the edge of the dining room, the noise faded behind us, replaced by something quieter, more contained, the kind of silence that does not come from absence, but from intention, and Dominic slowed just slightly, enough to let me come even with him instead of trailing behind. A small detail, easy to miss, but not accidental. Nothing about him was accidental. He glanced at me again, not down, not dismissive, just direct, measuring something he had not yet defined. "Last chance," he said, not threatening, not forcing, just stating, like he was offering me an exit he did not expect me to take. And I met his gaze without hesitation, steady, unchanged. "I do not need one," I said, and that was it, the final confirmation, because something in his expression settled after that, like the question had been answered in a way he respected, and without another word, he pushed open the door at the end of the hallway, revealing a darker, quieter space beyond, and I stepped inside first. The room beyond the door did not feel like part of the restaurant. It felt like something else entirely. Quieter, heavier, the kind of place where decisions were made without witnesses and where the rules shifted depending on who was standing inside. The lighting was dim, softer than the main floor, but sharper in its shadows, casting long lines across polished concrete and dark wood, and the air carried a different kind of silence. Not the polite kind from before, but the kind that waited, and I stepped further in without hesitation, my footsteps steady, measured, like I had been here before even though I had not, because spaces like this were not about familiarity. They were about presence, and I could feel his behind me, not crowding, not rushing, just there, controlled, watching, always watching. The door closed with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing the moment into something private, something that no longer belonged to the outside world. And I turned to face him fully for the first time since we left the main room. No tray in my hands now. No distraction, no distance created by circumstance, just two people standing in a space where pretense did not hold the same weight. And for a second, nothing happened, no immediate move, no sudden escalation, just stillness, the kind that tests who breaks it first, and I did not. I let it sit, let it stretch, because I had learned a long time ago that silence can say more than action if you know how to hold it, and Dominic Hayes understood that too. I could see it in the way he did not rush to fill the space, in the way his posture remained relaxed but intentional, like everything about him was chosen, even the pauses. "You surprised me," he said finally, voice lower now without the need to carry, stripped of the performance from before, and there was something almost honest in it, not soft, not warm, just real, and I shrugged slightly, a small movement that felt louder in the quiet. "That seems to happen a lot tonight," I replied, and for a moment, the corner of his mouth lifted again, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, and then his gaze shifted, not away, but different, more focused, more precise, like he was no longer looking at me as a whole, but breaking me down into parts, stance, balance, the way I held my shoulders, the way my weight settled evenly instead of shifting nervously, and I knew that look. I had seen it before in places very different from this one, Places that did not have chandeliers or tailored suits. Places where people paid attention to details like that because they mattered, because they told you everything you needed to know before anything even started. And that was when I realized he was not guessing anymore. He was observing, calculating, adjusting his understanding in real time. "You are not nervous," he said, not asking, just stating, and I shook my head once, simple, honest, no. And that answer hung there, heavier than it should have been, because it did not match what he expected, and I saw it register, not as confusion, but as confirmation of something he had already begun to suspect. He stepped slightly to the side then, creating space between us, not closing it, not invading, just opening the area like he was setting a boundary without saying it out loud. And I mirrored it without thinking, adjusting my own position naturally, instinctively. And that was the moment everything shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because it was no longer just about words, it was about movement, about awareness, about something deeper than either of us had acknowledged out loud yet, the kind of understanding that does not come from conversation, but from experience, and he saw it. I knew he did, because his expression changed, just slightly, enough to lose the last trace of casual amusement, replaced by something sharper, something more alert, like he had just realized the situation was not as simple as he first thought. "Interesting," he murmured again, quieter this time, almost to himself, and then he looked at me fully, no distraction, no pretense left between us. "Show me," he said, and the words were simple, but the meaning was not, because this was no longer a challenge thrown for control. This was something else now, something that had shifted into curiosity, into recognition, into a moment where he was no longer entirely certain of the outcome. And for the first time that night, I felt it clearly, not tension, not pressure, but something steady and familiar, something that had nothing to do with where I worked or who he was, something that existed long before this room, long before this night, and I let out a slow breath, grounding myself in it, my hands relaxed at my sides, my posture settling into something natural, something that did not need to be explained, and I met his gaze one more time, calm, unwavering. "You first," I said. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, and that was the moment that mattered most, because I had just shifted something. Again, not by force, not by volume, but by expectation. Men like Dominic Hayes were used to leading, to initiating, to setting the pace without being questioned, and yet I had handed it back to him without yielding anything. And I saw it register, not as irritation, but as recalibration, the kind that happens when someone realizes the rules they assumed no longer apply. His eyes held mine, steady, searching, and then slowly, deliberately, he exhaled, like he was setting something aside, not his control, never that, but his assumptions, and that was more important, because assumptions are what make people predictable, and he was no longer treating me like something predictable. "All right," he said quietly, and there was no arrogance in it now, no performance, just clarity. He stepped forward, not aggressively, not rushed, just enough to close the distance slightly, his movements controlled, efficient, the kind that came from someone who understood space, who understood timing, and I watched him the way he had been watching me, not reacting, not flinching, just observing, because that is where everything begins, not in action, but in awareness. He shifted his weight subtly, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, testing the ground, testing the moment, and I recognized it instantly, not because I had seen him do it before, but because I had done it myself 100 times, in places that did not look anything like this, places where the air smelled different, where the stakes were not measured in money or reputation, but in something more immediate, more personal, and that recognition settled into me like a quiet confirmation. He was not untrained, not careless, but he was also not expecting what he was about to find. And that was the difference. He moved first, not fast, not slow, just precise, a controlled motion meant to test, to gauge, to see how I would respond. And I did not step back, I did not retreat, I adjusted, just enough, a shift of balance, a change in angle, nothing dramatic, nothing that would look like anything to someone who did not understand what they were seeing, but it was enough to tell him that this was not going to go the way he thought, and I saw it again. That flicker, that moment where realization begins but does not fully form yet, because it takes Time for someone to accept that they have misjudged a situation, especially someone who is not used to being wrong. He paused, just slightly, just enough to reassess. And in that pause, I moved, not to escalate, not to dominate, but to answer, to show him the same thing he had just shown me. Control, precision, awareness, a mirrored response that carried its own message without a single word being spoken. And the space between us changed again, tighter now, more focused, like everything unnecessary had fallen away, and all that remained was the understanding building between us, layer by layer, action by action. You have done this before, he said, voice lower, more certain now. And I did not deny it. I did not confirm it either. I simply held his gaze, steady, letting the answer exist without being spoken, because sometimes silence is the clearest response, and he understood that. I could see it in the way his posture shifted again, less casual now, more deliberate, like he had just stepped into a different version of the situation, one where he was no longer leading alone, one where he had to consider something he had not planned for. And for the first time since this began, the balance between us felt equal, not in status, not in the world outside this room, but here, in this space, in this moment. And that is something men like him do not experience often, if ever. Who are you? He asked finally, not as a demand, not as a command, but as a genuine question. And I let a small breath leave my chest, calm, steady, grounded, before answering him in the simplest way possible. Someone you underestimated. And this time, he did not smile. He did not laugh. He just looked at me. Really looked, like he was seeing me for the first time without the filter of assumptions. And in that look, I knew, whatever this was, it had already changed both of us more than either of us expected. Something shifted after that. Not in the way we moved, not in the distance between us, but in the space underneath it all, like the moment had crossed an invisible line neither of us could step back from. And I could feel it in the way the room seemed smaller now, more focused, like everything outside of this interaction had stopped mattering entirely. Dominic Hayes did not speak again right away, and that silence was different from before, not testing, not measuring, but absorbing, like he was replaying every second that had led us here and adjusting his understanding piece by piece. And I let him. I did not interrupt it, because I knew what that kind of thinking looked like. I knew the weight of it, the way it recalibrated everything you thought you understood about a person in front of you. And when he finally moved again, it was slower, more deliberate, like every motion carried intention instead of instinct. He circled slightly, not pacing, not threatening, just changing his angle, watching how I responded to it, and I matched it without thinking, a natural adjustment, smooth, controlled. And that was when the last piece clicked into place for him. I saw it clearly, not in his expression, because he kept that locked down, but in the way he stopped trying to lead the movement and instead began to share it, like he had accepted something without saying it out loud. You are trained, he said quietly, not a question anymore. And I let out a small breath, not defensive, not hesitant, just steady. Yes, I answered, simple, because there was no reason to deny it now, not in a space like this, not with someone who had already seen enough to know the truth. And that answer settled between us, heavy in a different way than before, not confrontational, but clarifying, because now we were no longer playing roles, no longer pretending this was about a waitress and a customer. This was something else entirely, something stripped down to two people who understood control in very different worlds, and I could see the shift in him, the way his posture adjusted again, less casual now, more aligned, like he had stepped into a version of himself that did not need to impress anyone, did not need to perform, just needed to be precise. And for the first time, I felt it from him, not pressure, not dominance, but respect, small, controlled, but real. And that changed everything, because respect from someone like him is not given lightly. It is earned in moments like this, in ways that do not need to be spoken out loud. That explains the confidence, he said, almost to himself, and there was no mockery in it, no edge, just observation. And I shook my head slightly, a small correction. No, I said, meeting his eyes again, steady, grounded. The confidence was there before, and that made him pause. Not long, just enough to register the meaning behind it, because confidence does not come from skill alone. It comes from something deeper, something built over time, and I could see that realization land. Subtle but undeniable. He studied me again, not trying to break me down this time, not trying to categorize, just seeing. And for a moment, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, because the need to prove something had faded, replaced by something quieter, something more complex. And then he nodded, once, slow, deliberate, like he had reached a conclusion he had not expected to reach when this began. You could have walked away, he said, and I considered that for a second, not the question itself, but the truth behind it, before answering honestly, so could you. And that was it, the final shift, because that answer removed the last illusion of control being one-sided. It placed us in the same space, on the same level, at least here, at least now. And for the first time that night, Dominic Hayes did not try to take that back. He did not correct it, did not challenge it. He simply accepted it. And in that acceptance, something changed in the air between us, something quieter, but stronger. Like whatever this was, it was no longer about proving who held power. It was about understanding what power meant when it met something that refused to bend. And as he took a small step back, creating space again, not as distance, but as acknowledgement, I realized something I had not expected when this night started. This was not a fight anymore. Not in the way he had meant it. Not in the way anyone outside that room would understand. It had already become something else entirely. Something that would not end the way either of us originally intended. The space between us did not feel tense anymore. It felt defined, like invisible lines had been drawn and neither of us had any intention of crossing them without purpose. And that clarity changed everything. Because when uncertainty fades, what remains is choice, and I could see it in him now. The way his shoulders eased just slightly, not relaxed, never careless, but no longer carrying the same edge from before, like he had stepped out of the role he played in public and into something more precise, more honest. This is not what I expected, he said finally, and there was no frustration in it, no irritation, just a quiet acknowledgement of something that had surprised him in a way he did not resist. And I let out a small breath, steady, grounded. That seems to be the theme tonight, I replied, and for a moment, something lighter passed between us, not humor exactly, but understanding, the kind that comes when two people recognize the same shift at the same time. And then he glanced toward the door, not as an escape, but as a reminder, the world outside still existed, still waiting, still watching in its own way, even if it could not see what had happened here. They're going to ask questions, he said, more to himself than to me, and I followed his gaze briefly before looking back at him. Let them, I answered, because whatever story they built would not match the truth of this moment anyway. And we both knew that. He studied me again, but differently this time, not searching for weakness, not testing boundaries, just taking in what was there without trying to reshape it. And that was new, for both of us. You are very calm for someone who just challenged a situation like this, he said. And I considered that for a second before answering honestly. I did not challenge it, I said. I just did not step back from it. And that distinction mattered, because stepping forward and refusing to move are not the same thing, and I saw it register. The way he nodded slightly, like he understood exactly what I meant. Most people would have, he said, and there was no judgment in it, just fact. And I shrugged lightly, a small movement that carried more weight than it should have. Most people are not me, I replied, and that earned something from him again. Not surprise this time, but recognition, like he was starting to see the pattern, starting to understand that this was not a momentary reaction. This was consistent, grounded, real, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to control. He took another step back then, creating a little more space. Not distancing, just resetting the frame, and I stayed where I was, steady, unchanged, because I did not need to adjust to him anymore, not the way I had at the beginning. And that was when I noticed it, the shift in his eyes, subtle but clear, the way they no longer carried that initial assumption, that immediate categorization. Instead, there was something else there now, something more careful, more intentional, like he was choosing how to see me. Instead of relying on what he thought he already knew. You did not answer my question, he said after a moment, and I tilted my head slightly. Which one? I asked, even though I already knew, and his gaze held mine, steady, direct. Who you are, he said, and the room seemed to settle again around that, quieter, more focused, Because that question carried more weight now than it had before. It was no longer curiosity. It was something closer to understanding, to placing something important into context, and I could have answered him a dozen different ways, could have given him a name, a job, a story that fit into something simple and easy to accept, but none of those would have been true in the way this moment required. So instead, I gave him the only answer that matched what had happened here. I am someone who does not fold just because the room expects it, I said, calm, steady, and I watched it land. Not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as truth. And for a second, just a second, Dominic Hayes did something I had not seen him do all night. He did not respond immediately. He just stood there, taking it in, like the answer mattered more than the next move. And in that pause, I realized something that felt both simple and significant at the same time. This was not about winning anymore. Not for him. Not for me. It was about something else entirely. Something that had started the moment neither of us chose to step back. And as he finally exhaled, slow and controlled, I knew, whatever came next, it would not look anything like the beginning of this night. The silence that followed my answer did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had been placed between us that neither of us could ignore anymore. And I saw it in the way Dominic Hayes held still, not frozen, not uncertain, but deliberate, like he was choosing not to rush past a moment that mattered more than either of us had expected when this began. His eyes stayed on me, steady, focused, and for the first time, there was no attempt to control what he saw, no effort to reshape it into something easier to manage. He was simply taking it in. And that kind of attention is rare, especially from someone who has built a life on deciding quickly, acting decisively, never hesitating. And yet here he was, pausing, considering, letting the moment exist without forcing it forward. You are not what you look like, he said finally, and it was not an accusation, not even a question, just a quiet recognition of something he had already accepted, and I let a small breath leave my chest, not defensive, not guarded, just honest. Neither are you, I replied, because the version of him that walked into that dining room and the one standing here now were not the same either, and he knew it. I could see it in the slight shift of his expression, the way something in his gaze sharpened, not with tension, but with awareness, like he had just realized that whatever he was used to showing the world was not what I was responding to. And that changed the balance again, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, lasting one. He took a step to the side, slow, measured, not distancing, just resetting the angle between us. And I did not follow this time. I stayed where I was, letting him move around me instead of adjusting to him. And that was another shift, small, but meaningful, because it showed him something without words. I was not reacting to him anymore. I was existing beside him. And that difference carries weight. His eyes tracked the movement, not missing it, not dismissing it, just acknowledging it. And for a moment, the room felt even quieter, like the air itself had settled into something steady, something balanced. You said this was not about stepping back, he said after a second, his voice low, thoughtful. So what is it about? And that question landed differently than the others, because it was not about control, not about challenge, it was about understanding. And I considered it carefully, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it the right way, the way that matched what had actually happened here. It is about standing still when someone expects you to move, I said finally, calm, grounded, and I saw it connect, the way his gaze held mine just a fraction longer, the way his posture remained steady instead of shifting away, like he was testing the truth of it against everything he had seen so far. And it fit, it aligned with every moment that had brought us here, every choice, every pause, every decision not to give in to expectation, and that realization did something, not dramatic, not obvious, but real. It settled something between us, something that had been shifting since the beginning, and for the first time, there was no tension left in it, just clarity. Most people cannot do that, he said quietly, and I nodded once, simple, because that was true. It always had been, and then he let out a slow breath, not heavy, not frustrated, just controlled, like he had reached the end of a thought that mattered. And when he looked at me again, there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before, not curiosity, not calculation, something closer to respect. And that changed everything in a way that did not need to be announced, because respect is not loud, It is not forced, it just exists. And I felt it, steady, undeniable. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to challenge. The fight he had asked for had already happened in a way neither of us expected, not through force, not through dominance, but through something quieter, something harder to fake. And as he straightened slightly, adjusting his sleeve like the moment had reached its natural end, I realized something that made the entire night make sense in a way it had not before. He had not lost control in this room. He had chosen to share it. And that is something far more rare than winning. This does not end here, he said finally, not as a threat, not as a promise, just as a fact. And I met his gaze without hesitation, steady, unchanged. No, I agreed softly, because we both understood now, whatever this was, it had already moved beyond a single moment, and neither of us was walking away from it the same way we had walked in. The words settled between us with a quiet weight, not heavy, not threatening, just certain, and I could feel it in the way the room seemed to exhale around that understanding, like something that had been building since the beginning had finally reached a point where it no longer needed to push forward. It could simply exist, and that was new, not just for me, but for him too. I could see it in the way Dominic Hayes did not rush to fill the silence this time, did not try to steer the moment into something more familiar, more controlled. Instead, he let it remain what it was, unforced, unstructured, and that alone told me more about him than anything he had said so far, because men like him do not sit in uncertainty unless they choose to, and choosing to means something. He glanced once more toward the door, then back at me, and there was a shift again, subtle but clear. The version of him that handled the outside world was returning, not replacing what had just happened, but layering over it, like a suit put back on after being briefly set aside. You should go back out there, he said, and it was not a command, not quite a suggestion either, more like a recognition of reality, of roles that still existed beyond this room, and I understood that, even if I did not feel bound by it the same way I had earlier. I nodded once, slow, deliberate, because I was choosing to move now, not reacting, not retreating, just deciding, and that distinction mattered. I turned slightly toward the door, but before I reached for it, I paused, not out of hesitation, but because something in the moment was not finished yet, not completely, and I looked back at him, meeting his eyes one more time, steady, grounded, and for a second, neither of us spoke, because words were not necessary to acknowledge what had changed. It was already there, clear, undeniable. And then he did something small, something most people would miss if they were not paying attention. He stepped aside, just enough to give me a clear path, not blocking, not leading, simply making space. And that, more than anything else, told me exactly how much had shifted, because space is not something men like him give without reason. I walked past him then, close enough to feel the quiet presence he carried without it pressing against me, close enough to understand that whatever this was, it was not over, not by a long shot. And as my hand reached for the door handle, I heard his voice again, low, controlled, but carrying something new underneath it, something that had not been there before. Next time, he said, and I stopped, just slightly, not turning yet, letting the words settle before I answered. Next time, I repeated, calm, certain, and only then did I open the door, stepping back into the hallway where the world felt louder again, brighter, more predictable, but also different, because I was different walking back into it. The weight of the tray would return, the expectations, the roles, the assumptions, all of it waiting just beyond that threshold, but none of it held the same power it had before, because something inside me had already proven otherwise. I walked back toward the dining room with steady steps, the sound of conversation rising again as I approached, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of people pretending nothing unusual had happened. And when I stepped back onto the floor, heads turned, subtle, careful, like no one wanted to be obvious about their curiosity. But no one could ignore it either. I picked up a tray from the side station, my hands steady, my movements precise, exactly as they had been before, except now there was something different in the way I held myself, something that did not shrink under their attention, something that did not adjust to their expectations. And as I moved between tables again, I could feel it, the shift in how they looked at me, not just as a server, not just as part of the background, but as something they could not quite define anymore. And I knew why. Because even if they had not seen what happened behind that door, they could sense that something had changed, and across the room, near the entrance, I caught a glimpse of him again. Dominic Hayes standing exactly where he had been earlier, composed, controlled, surrounded by the same quiet authority, but when his eyes found mine, there was no dismissal in them, no assumption, just recognition, clear and steady, and for a brief moment, the noise around us faded again, just like before, except this time, it was not tension that filled the space between us, it was something else entirely, something quieter, but far more dangerous, because it did not need to prove itself, it already knew what it was. The rhythm of the room tried to pull me back into it, the familiar pattern of movement and service, the practiced balance of trays and timing. But something in me no longer fit that rhythm the same way, not because I had changed what I was doing, but because I had changed how I stood inside it. And that difference is subtle to everyone else, but impossible to ignore once you feel it yourself. I moved between tables with the same precision, the same quiet efficiency, but there was no weight in it anymore, no invisible pressure to shrink, to disappear into the background, and I could tell they noticed, not consciously, not in a way they could explain, but in the way conversations paused just a fraction longer when I approached, in the way eyes lingered a second too long before looking away, like something about me no longer matched the role they expected, and across the room, he was still there, Dominic Hayes, standing exactly where a man like him belongs in a place like this. Composed, untouchable, surrounded by a space people do not enter without permission, and yet when his gaze met mine again, it did not carry distance, it carried memory, a quiet acknowledgement of something that existed outside of this setting, something that could not be reduced to a server and a guest, and that made everything else feel thinner, less defined. I turned my attention back to the table in front of me, setting down a glass with steady hands, responding to a question with the same calm tone I always used. But even in the middle of that, I could feel it, the thread of awareness connecting across the room, not pulling, not demanding, just there, steady, present, and I realized something that settled into me with quiet certainty. He was watching not to control, not to test, but to understand, and that is a very different kind of attention, one that does not fade when the moment passes, one that follows what comes after. And I wondered briefly what he saw now, not the version of me that stood in that private room, but this version, moving through the space that had defined me just an hour ago, and whether those two versions aligned in his mind or conflicted, because they did not conflict for me. They never had. They were simply different parts of the same truth, and I did not need to choose between them. A voice pulled me back, a customer asking for another bottle, and I nodded, stepping away toward the bar, the movement smooth, automatic. But even there, even in the routine, I could feel the shift. The bartender hesitated for a second before handing me the bottle, his eyes flicking toward the entrance, then back to me, like he had heard something, seen something, or maybe just felt the same thing everyone else had, that something had happened, something they did not fully understand but could not ignore, and I took the bottle without comment. Returning to the table, pouring carefully, evenly, the liquid catching the light as it filled each glass, and when I straightened, I did not look toward him right away. I let the moment settle, let the space breathe, because I did not need to confirm what I already knew, and when I finally did glance across the room again, he had moved, not far, just enough to change his position slightly, but his attention had not shifted. It remained exactly where it had been, and that consistency told me everything. This was not curiosity that would fade with distraction. This was something more deliberate, more intentional, something that would continue. And as I moved to my next table, tray balanced, steps measured, I felt it clearly. The night had not returned to normal. It had simply moved forward, carrying something with it that would not be left behind. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself the smallest, quietest realization. Whatever came next, I was not just part of it, I was shaping it too. The night moved forward, but it did not move past what had happened. It carried it, quietly, beneath every interaction, beneath every step I took across the floor, and I could feel it in the way nothing felt accidental anymore. Every glance, every pause, every shift in the room seemed connected to something deeper, like an undercurrent no one could see but everyone could sense, and I worked through it the way I always did, steady, precise, grounded in routine, but the routine itself felt different now, lighter in some ways, sharper in others, like I was seeing it from the outside while still standing inside it. And across the room, Dominic Hayes remained a constant, not moving much, not speaking loudly, but present in a way that shaped everything around him without effort. And that presence did not press on me the way it might have earlier. It did not demand anything. It simply existed alongside mine, and that balance was new, unfamiliar in a way that did not feel uncomfortable, just rare. I finished clearing a table, stacking plates with careful hands, and as I turned toward the service station, I felt it again, that quiet awareness, not pulling, not intrusive, just there, and this time I did not ignore it. I let my gaze lift across the room, meeting his without hesitation, and there was no surprise in his expression, no question, just recognition, like he had been expecting that moment, like he knew exactly when I would choose to look back, and something in that made the distance between us feel smaller, not physically, but in a way that mattered more, and I realized then that this was no longer about a single interaction, it was about continuity, about what happens when two people do not forget what passed between them, even when everything else tries to return to normal. A manager passed by me quickly, his voice low, tense, asking if everything was handled, if there would be any issues, and I answered simply, calmly, "It is handled." And he nodded, relieved without understanding why, because from the outside, this had been resolved, contained, closed, but I knew better, and so did Dominic. I could see it in the way he shifted slightly, just enough to signal attention without drawing it. And that small movement carried intention, not to call me over, not to command, but to acknowledge, like a conversation continuing without words, and I felt it clearly, the invitation without pressure, the recognition without demand, and I did not move toward him, not yet, because this was not something that required immediate action, it was something that would unfold in its own time, on its own terms, and I had no intention of rushing that. I picked up another tray, balancing it easily, my steps measured as I moved through the space again, and I could feel the difference now, not just in myself, but in how the room responded, the subtle shift in how people made space, how they watched, how they adjusted without knowing why, like something about me no longer fit neatly into the background. And that awareness did not make me uncomfortable, it grounded me. Further, because I understood it, I understood what it meant to be seen in a way that could not be undone. And across the room, Dominic Hayes did not look away, not when others approached him, not when conversations resumed around him. His attention remained steady, quiet, deliberate, and that told me everything I needed to know. This was not a moment that would fade into memory. It was something that had taken root, something that would continue beyond this night, beyond this room. And as I set down the tray at another table, my hands steady, my movements precise, I allowed myself one final glance in his direction, and when our eyes met again, there was no question left, no uncertainty, just a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. Whatever this was, it had already begun, and neither of us was going to pretend otherwise. By the time the night began to thin out, the energy in the room had shifted into something quieter, more controlled, like a story that had already reached its turning point and was now settling into whatever came next. The clinking of glasses softened, conversations lost their sharp edges, and people began to gather their things with the kind of ease that comes when nothing unexpected is left to happen. Except I knew better, because some things do not end when the room decides they should. Some things continue in the space between what is seen and what is understood, and I felt that now more clearly than ever. I moved through the final tasks of my shift with the same steady rhythm, clearing tables, resetting silverware, aligning everything back into place as if the night had followed a predictable path. But underneath that routine, there was something else, something that did not reset, something that remained exactly where it had been since the moment it began. And when I finally set the last tray down, when the last guest stood and the last chair was pushed back into position, I allowed myself to pause, just for a second, not because I needed the rest, but because I understood that this was the moment where everything could have returned to what it was before, and it did not. I lifted my gaze toward the entrance one last time, not expecting anything, not searching, just knowing, and he was still there, Dominic Hayes. Exactly where he had been when the night began to unwind. like he had never truly left the moment we created, and when his eyes met mine, there was no distance in it, no question, just a quiet certainty that matched my own, and that was when I understood something that settled into me with a calm that did not need to be tested. This had never been about the room, or the people in it, or even the situation that brought us together. It had been about recognition, about seeing something real where neither of us expected to find it, and not turning away from it once it appeared. He moved then, finally, not quickly, not dramatically, just a few steps forward, enough to close some of the distance without erasing it entirely. And that restraint meant more than any action could have, because it showed intention, control, choice, and I stayed where I was, not because I could not move, but because I did not need to, not anymore. We had already crossed the space that mattered. You handled yourself well tonight, he said, and there was no trace of arrogance in it, no condescension, just a simple acknowledgement, and I met his gaze, steady, grounded. So did you, I replied, and that earned the smallest shift in his expression, something almost like agreement, almost like respect spoken without words, and for a moment, the world around us felt distant again, not silent, not gone, just less important, because this moment did not depend on it. You are not staying here, he said. After a second, not as a question, but as a statement that carried its own quiet certainty, and I tilted my head slightly, considering him. Not forever, I answered, honest, because that had always been true, long before tonight, long before him, and he nodded once, like that answer fit into something he had already begun to understand. Good, he said, not as approval, but as recognition of something that aligned with his own expectations. And then there was a pause, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just complete, like the moment had reached its natural end without needing to be forced. And as he stepped back slightly, not turning away yet, just creating space again, I realized the final truth of the night. This had never been about who won, or who led, or who controlled the outcome. It had been about what happens when two people refuse to be defined by the roles they are placed in, and in that refusal, something real is revealed, something that does not disappear when the lights go down or the doors close, something that continues, quietly, steadily, beyond the moment it began. Next time, he said again, the same words, but different now, carrying meaning that had not existed before, and I held his gaze, calm, certain, unchanged. Next time, I answered, because now I understood what it meant, not a continuation of the same moment, but the beginning of something neither of us would ignore. And as he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the world that had shaped him long before I stepped into it, I did not feel like I was watching him leave. I felt like I was watching something begin, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself a small, quiet thought that stayed with me even as I stepped back into my own world. He did not lose control. He chose to see me, and that was far more dangerous than anything either of us had planned.